My pleasure first of all to introduce Mary Rose Barrington. Mary Rose, it's interesting actually, Mary Rose joined the council 50 years ago. She's a vice president, and just to put that into perspective, 50 years ago this month was when Star Trek started. There was a reference to Star Trek. So Mary Rose, you came with Star Trek, and very appreciative of both. She's also probably one of the few people who has actually attended every one of our 40th conferences. So I won't take a survey of how many other people did that, but we much appreciate it, Mary Rose, and we're particularly pleased therefore that you can give your talk today, which is entitled Telepathy, Putting the Horse Before the Cart.
Thank you, Bernard. Right, so who are, I ask, the prima donnas of telepathy? Well, I think a lot of us would probably go for the mediums of the cross correspondences, because whether they were receiving material from the dead communicators or living sitters or more remote sources, they must have been operating at least some of the time by telepathy, acquiring content from the minds of others, whether the living or the dead. Certainly when the source of telepathically received content is the presumed or hoped to be dead communicators, well, telepathy then is seen as a virtuoso performance by the medium. She, and it is usually she, is given a name, a photograph, an object, or just a sitter who wants a communication, and it's up to her to attract the attention of a communicator. Fluent communicators like Myers and George Pelham, personalities, if they were really who they claimed to be, it's clear that in the telepathic interchange, their role was momentous, mind-blowing, in fact beyond the powers of the thesaurus. But their modus operandi is beyond our powers to examine. In any case, the medium must be credited with taking the initial step of making contact. And when it comes to appraising the medium's achievement in delivering a convincing communication, it's fair enough that she features as the virtuosic soloist. Now, it's not such a fair appraisal when the telepathic receiver takes part in experiments and plays her part in spontaneous cases. The receiver is usually still seen as the soloist, while the agent, the telepathic emitter, the source of the material she receives, figures as the accompanist. And however many complicated notes she plays, nobody goes to listen to the accompanist. So I want to turn the spotlight today on this less regarded agent. The role of the dead communicator being beyond our ken, we must look to the living for clues as to the role of the agent. And here there are two possibilities. One is to look at the agent in real-life situations, and the other is to look at the agent in experiments. Well, before going further, I must say I am assuming, not with any originality, that at some level our minds are in a sort of telepathic network of some sort, that in the sub-basement of our unconscious we have a lot of material that originated in the minds of other people. My other assumption is the common idea that a filter mechanism blocks this material from rising into consciousness, shielding us from a state of total confusion. Above the sub-basement, at a level that might be called the lower ground floor, there's an area in which material immediately relevant to our personal concerns may arrive and be elevated into the consciousness before it sinks down to the depths. So the telepath who receives this information has something akin to sharp hearing. Of course, we can all, to some extent, hear our name mentioned amid a lot of chatter. The telepath has acute psychic hearing, and I see this ability as having the same sort of relationship to most people's fairly negligible psychic response as calculating prodigies and pi decimal reciters have to people with average mathematical abilities and aptitudes. So conceptually, this is a fairly simple and, as paranormal effects go, not all that mind-boggling facility. Turning now to the other end of the telepathic exchange, it seems to me that knottier psi-related issues arise when we turn the spotlight on the initiator, the agent who externalizes the shared material. In real life, it seems clear that bad news makes the biggest waves and attracts the attention of the occasional telepath, the ordinary citizen who may have a psi alarm ring in his mind once or twice in a lifetime. No one seems curious enough to report unexplained feelings of joy and finds that at that ecstatic moment his cousin or his twin has won the national lottery. It just doesn't happen. It is threats to the agent of death, accident, pain, anxiety and shock, especially shock, that sends out the sort of alert that evokes a telepathic response. Whether the response is awareness of a situation, hallucination, a community of sensation, a sense of panic, an urge to action, or just a sinking feeling. I think we can dismiss the idea of the ordinary citizen roving around with some sort of telepathic radar, seeking out sad news from family and friends. It is much more likely that the occasional telepath is in a perfectly normal state, but is jolted into psi-awareness by the attention-seeking urgency of the personal transmission initiated by the agent. The occasional telepath may see a vision of his dying dog, or may feel as if he's having a heart attack, or drowning, or hear a voice summoning him home, or just know that something bad has happened. Whatever the nature of the telepathic communication, the telepath is having the contents of his mind modified by signals projected from the mind of the distant agent, even though those signals have probably been projected without any intention. Perhaps in the same way that some people have reported being projected out of body when subjected to life-threatening shock. So far as experimental work is concerned, there are two problems. The first being that with protocols dependent on statistical assessment, even when quality as well as quantity is involved, you never know which hits were due to ESP and which were due to chance. And if you assume that a high degree of correspondence between target and response identifies the paranormal element, you may be wrong. The second problem is that it is usually impossible to disentangle a telepathic duet from the solo performance of a clairvoyant. Experiments are nearly always based on the pattern of target and response, and the target has to take some material form: writing, drawing, directions, photography, video, spoken material, sensory stimulus, whatever. Something has to be put on record before the response is elicited. If the target consists in any form outside the mind of the agent, it is open to clairvoyance, and that faculty that seems to be much more under control by clairvoyance than is telepathy by telepaths. When it comes to master clairvoyants like Didier and Osowiecki, agency appears to play no role at all in the identification of targets, and some of Osowiecki's experimenters made a point of excluding all possibility of telepathy because they were keen to prove the reality of clairvoyance. It is easy, if laborious, to exclude the operation of telepathy in target response experiments, but it is pretty well impossible to exclude clairvoyance. That observation may not come as a great surprise, but when I say it's almost also impossible to exclude psychokinesis, that probably will. In my various recastings of the ideas I'm putting forward today, I have tried creeping up on the PK theme, but finally I've decided it's better to pounce and say that I see a link between these two manifestations, the mental chalk and the physical cheese, what Robert Thales called psi gamma and psi kappa. However resistant psi deniers may be to telepathy with all its radio-like echoes, the strangeness of ESP pales before the weirdness of PK. At the more decorous end of PK, it's not too upsetting if you just make matches or even compass needles move a smidgen, as if putting out little jets of psi. But in the sounds room and in poltergeist outbreaks, the forces of PK may manifest on an alarming scale, apparently regardless of spatial limitations. PK is mostly seen as operating on inert matter, but it also operates on organic matter. For example, promoting or retarding the growth of seeds and cells. Healers are more likely to be involved in this sort of experiment, and they would talk of healing force rather than PK. Further up the biological scale, we have, well, among other things, D. Mill's experiments, mental interaction with living systems, looking very like healers talking to seeds, and both looking very like PK. At this level, we see a crucial fusion of PK, healing force, and mental interaction. Moving further up the chain to 2- and 4-legged animals, including humans, that is, living systems considered by healers and most parapsychologists to have minds, we have two new factors. It is, I think, widely assumed that in influencing seeds and cells, microorganisms and perhaps even insects, a physical force acts on the tissues of the organism, on the radiotherapy model. One has the impression with hands-on healing that this is also the process involved. But there is the alternative scenario that the healer acts on the mind of the patient and drives him to heal himself, a methodology that would work well with treating psychosomatic illness, which would be liable to recur if the body was treated directly without the contents of the mind being modified. Mindful beings, capable of telepathic reception, can, it is averred, be effectively treated remotely, so that the process certainly starts by the healer seeking to engage the mind of the patient. Well, I don't know of any well-evidenced cases of remote healing, but I can cite some experiments in remote hypnosis witnessed by no other than Frederick Myers. In moving sideways from healing to hypnosis, I would say that some spectacular cases of healing have been done under hypnosis, and I assume, without having time to or the expertise to argue it, that healing is at least a first cousin of hypnosis and probably an identical twin. I said some time ago that clairvoyance could not be eliminated from target and response experiments. But these are not the only volitional procedures involving telepathy. The experiments reported in the proceedings by Myers were described by him as hypnosis à distance and were carried out in France by researchers using their servants as hypnotees. And perhaps because of this relationship, the projected material consisted of orders, which is essentially what healers deliver to patients. Among the experiments, for example, was a post-hypnotic command delivered telepathically to the effect that the servant would receive a visit from Professor X many months later. And when questioned after the due date, she was insistent in the face of logical argument that this imaginary visit was real. In real-life cases, telepathic signals emitted by the unconscious emitter seem to arrive at the threshold of an empathetic receiver as if asking admittance to his conscious mind and knocking at the door. But the orders delivered to the servants were intended to remain below the threshold of consciousness while acting on it. So they were aimed at something more like forcible entry into the basement, where secret modifications are made to some important functions. Another variety of telepathic exercise in command and compliance come to us from staring experiments. And I'm thinking especially of the ones done by Rupert Sheldrake, his real-life observations of people who didn't know they were being looked at. Though framed, like those with cooperating participants, as be aware that someone is looking at you, the thrust of the command is turn round, because this is the only way the experimenter can know that the message has arrived. I think it's worth noting that on successful trials, the person being stared at does not, he looks around rather than put up a hand to feel his neck, despite the clear focusing of attention on his back. That again points to direct action on the mind. And like the distant hypnosis experiments, the aim here is to compel action, not to convey the message I'm being asked to look round. When you put seed stimulation and retardation, emails, remote healing, staring experiments, hypnotic command, and psychokinesis into a pot together, what you get and what bearing has it has the product on telepathic agency. Well, I think you get something like a case reported by Louisa Ryan, as a case of telepathy, of course, in which the telepathic content consisted of a compulsion to act. A woman was preparing lunch for a group of children who were a little distance away at the seashore. Suddenly she felt driven to drop everything, and everything was quite complicated, and run to the shore, where she found a child in a panic-stricken need of help, stranded on a cliff somewhere. Dr. Ryan observed that it was unexplained compulsion to action that had the greatest impact on telepathic receivers, orders in fact. It seems to me that we have slid from something PK-like at the lower end of the biological scale to telepathy at the mindful end. But even simple organisms have something akin to control centers. And coming finally to the crunch point, I'm suggesting that whether it's seeds, insects, animals, or us, whatever distance between the emitter and the receiver is having his mind or control center acted upon hypnotically by PK. PK is often thought of as directional, like a jet or spray from a hose nozzle. But psychic force, to use the language of William Crookes, is much more pervasive and free from spatial limitation. Poltergeist effects can take place in unpeopled rooms and houses, and roofs can be bombarded by stones from somewhere. There is good reason for positing that PK can operate remotely. And what do we mean by remote in psi terms anyway? I think I would not be alone in thinking that the distance between agent and receiver is measurable in affinity rather than mileage. So when the explorer Stanley, somewhere in Africa, suddenly became aware that his own nanny had died in England, his mind content was modified by PK emitted by the dying person at a distance. So PK and telepathic reception gives us a good case of long-distance telepathy. Stanley's telepathic experience is much more typical than the volitional telepathy that we've been considering because of the light it throws on agency in command and compliance trials. But there's no reason for unconsciously emitted signals in real life critical situations, to have less force than those initiated in the conscious mind of experimenters, in fact, or people who are trying to convey a message. The signals still have to be sent out at unconscious level. Well, of course they do, because no one knows how to go about consciously transmitting telepathic material. Coming to an end, these emergent ideas, and I prefer emergent to half-baked, are placed on the table as work in progress rather than as a finished product. The fully baked product could begin to present itself as a grand unified theory, and that is a bridge too far for me. But one thing I think I can say with confidence is that telepathy is a twosome, and the agent, whatever he's actually doing, is a main player. In fact, he is the one who is providing the horsepower. That's it.
Thank you, Mary Rose. You finished actually 4 minutes early, so we have time for questions now.
It was a very interesting talk, and I think that it's correct to put more emphasis on the agent sending the telepathic impressions I'm here. But I had one question. PK as a mechanism. I question that because that assumes that mind is generated by brain, that is physical. And if mind is independent of brain, it's more like a dualist interactive situation, then it seems like it should be a more direct influence on the mind, even though we have resistance electromagnetic or electrical dermal activity measurements. That comes from the subconscious to the body. So I think it is not completely satisfying to me that we assume that it is PK which influences the body and not the mind directly.
Well, I don't know why one should assume that PK is any more dependent on the brain than is telepathy. I mean, in one sense, they are both dependent on the brain because, well, I mean, I'm assuming that it is the mind that, in a sense, directs the brain rather than the brain directs the mind. But I think it may be that we simply have to use the mechanism of the brain both to send out, so to speak, the PK end and to receive. And that if there is actually something seriously lacking in your brain, you're actually not going to be any more effective at telepathic reception than you would be at telepathic emission. And when I say I think the mind controls the brain, I'm thinking of reports that come out occasionally that don't seem actually to understand the implications. I mean, for example, taxi drivers who have to learn the map of London and skewer roads all over Greater London, tremendous feat really of memory. The area of the brain that actually covers visual representation and will assist the memory of street layout, that gets bigger as they learn and as they operate as taxi drivers. But when they retire, that brain that part of the brain shrinks back to normal dimensions. Well, one can't imagine that people become taxi drivers because their brain suddenly increases. Obviously the brain increases in size in the area where they've chosen to operate. So I think the fact that the mind may operate through the brain, just as we may send emails via computer, I don't see that really that makes PK any more brain dependent than the other end of receiving telepathically.
Okay, final question from...
It's more of an observation, Bernard, in response to our friend John from Norway, about the distinction, the mechanism of telepathy and PK through the mind and the brain. This is something that I know was perplexing for Frederick Myers. We've heard a lot about Frederick Myers today, but this was a subject that gave him particular interest, and he arrived at the conclusion, if I may quote him, paraphrase him, is that the communication is passed from the conscious will of the agent to the recipient using the same neurological infrastructure that all communications use, i.e. the brain, but go via the conscious awareness of the agent to the subliminal, that is the non-conscious mechanisms of the mind, not the brain of the recipient, but the mind, and then that goes through from the subconscious into the conscious, where it's processed by the brain. That is my understanding of how that mechanism works.
Yes, I think, I don't know that I disagree with that.
Okay, well that's, I think we're going to have to draw the discussion to a close. But maybe it's just worth stressing, Mary Rose, your conclusion that, PK plays a crucial role is, of course, also fits in with the popular sort of observational theory idea that the quantum explanation says that PK has to be the fundamental process. So, yeah.
Oh yes.
Anyway.
Yes, I think PK rules the world.
Right. Thank you, Mary Rose, very much. Very much.